Good evening. My jungle adventure is fully over. I'm back, I'm recovered. The show is back on from 7 p.m. every night, and it's from our brand new Westminster studio. Now, Baroness Michelle Mone is all over the front pages today. There it is. It's a huge scandal, and yet, is that the real PPE scandal? Because I don't think it is. I've got to ask tonight also, whilst I was away, David Cameron, now Lord Cameron, became Foreign Secretary, but given his track record, is he really fit for the job? And this studio that I'm broadcasting from is named after veteran, legendary broadcaster Alistair Stewart. So who better to join me for Talking Pints than Alistair himself? All of that after the news with Sophia Wensler.
Thank you, Nigel. Good evening. I'm Sophia Wensler in the GB Newsroom. Russell Brand has been questioned by police for a second time over alleged sexual offences. The actor and comedian was interviewed under caution last week over 6 allegations after being questioned last month over 3 other claims. The 48-year-old has been accused of rape, assault and emotional abuse between 2006 and 2013, following a joint investigation by the Sunday Times, The Times and Channel 4 dispatches. He strongly denies the claims. A body that was found in the River Wensum in Norwich has been formally identified as Gaynor Lord. The mother of 3 disappeared after leaving work in the city centre on the 8th of December. Police say the cause of death appears to be consistent with drowning and there are no indications of any third-party involvement. A protest over the government's immigration policies is taking place outside the Home Office in London. Refugee rights campaigners have gathered this evening under the banner Stop the Hate to mark International Migrants' Day. Organisers Stand Up to Racism emphasise the need to keep up the pressure against the government's, what they say are racist policies and the targeting of refugees and migrants. Justice Project founder Jeremy Corbyn has been spotted at the march, as well as Charlotte Khan from Care for Calais. Baroness Michelle Mone has hit out at the Prime Minister after he said he takes the scandal surrounding her involvement with a PPE firm incredibly seriously. It's after she admitted she's set to benefit from a contract between PPE firm MedPro and the government, which generated a £60 million profit. Posting on social media, Lady Mone said, "I was honest with the Cabinet Office and the NHS in my dealings with them." Yesterday, she told the BBC she contacted Michael Gove at the start of the pandemic after he made a call to arms for massive quantities of personal protective equipment. Rishi Sunak says the government has launched a legal case against the company.
This whole situation is subject to an ongoing criminal investigation, but also the government is taking action, legal action against the company involved. So there's a limit to what I can say, other than to say we take all these things incredibly seriously, and that's why the government's taking legal action, and because there's a criminal investigation ongoing, I can't comment any further.
Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer described the scandal as a shocking disgrace from top to bottom.
Every day goes past, there are more questions that need to be answered. There's now suggestions there was early private contact with members of the Cabinet that may have started this unhappy story in the first place. So the government needs to come clean, needs to make a statement about that. But this needs to be seen in its context. Under this government, £7 billion was lost in fraud during COVID. That's taxpayers' money, and if there were a Labour government, we'd want that money back.
Junior doctors in Wales will stage a 72-hour strike in the new year. They'll walk out from January the 15th after voting overwhelmingly in favour of industrial action in a dispute over pay. That's as the government and British Medical Association reached an agreement on reforms for specialist doctors. The offer, which will be put to members, proposes an additional pay rise of between 6.1% and 9.22%. Meanwhile, Labour is calling on the government to fund more overtime for doctors and nurses to help clear the NHS backlog. Sir Keir Starmer says his party would end the non-dom tax status as a way to fund it if it wins the next general election. During a hospital visit in Leeds, the Labour leader also promised a reduction in wait times for NHS appointments. 2 men have been arrested by counter-terror police after a ULEZ camera was damaged in a blast. The Met Police says a low-sophistication improvised explosive device was used in south-east London on the 6th of December. No one was injured when the IED was detonated in Sidcup, but vehicles and a residential property were damaged. Police say a 60-year-old man from the area is being questioned, along with a 61-year-old who was arrested in Horsham in West Sussex. And a new menopause drug to treat hot flushes has been given the green light in the UK. The daily pill called Veoza alleviates symptoms by regulating body temperature. Up to 80% of women going through the menopause are affected by the symptoms, which also include disruptive sleep patterns, changes to their mood and energy levels. This is GB News across the UK, on TV, in your car, on your digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now it's back to Nigel.
Good evening from our Westminster studio. So far, no technical issues. Let's hope it stays that way. Now, Baroness Michelle Mone is all over the front pages of our national newspapers today. She gave a big interview to the BBC yesterday, following on from a few press reports in the last couple of weeks, in which she says, look, I didn't tell the truth. You know, myself, my husband Doug, we were involved with a firm called MedPro. We previously said we were not. And it turns out, from the £200 million worth of orders they got from the government, they made a profit of about 60 million. And there's now today been a war of words between her and between Rishi Sunak. So on the face of it, this looks like the great scandal to have come out of the pandemic. But folks, it really isn't. And here's why. At the start of the pandemic, the Department of Health were desperately short of PPE across 7 major categories. For example, sterilised gowns, we were down to a supply of 1 day's stock. So during that period, when the pandemic kicked in, from February to July 2020, the department purchased, wait for it, 5 years' worth of PPE. Up to £10 billion worth of PPE purchased that has been written off, destroyed or lost. The prices they paid for it were about 5 times what the prices had been during the pandemic itself. And whichever way you look at this, we had PPE stored at 70 locations over the country. Some of it was still being stored in China. In fact, we were actually paying £400 million per annum simply in storage fees. £10 billion worth of our money was literally wasted. About £3 billion of the PPE your money went on actually got used. How could government have over-ordered on this scale? How on earth could they have wasted up to £10 billion of money? There were over 14,000 companies that applied for PPE contracts. Many people making very, very big profits out of it indeed. And yes, of course, there was a high priority lane where those that were known to government ministers had a much better chance of getting the orders. And of course, Baroness Mone was a part of that. I believe the real scandal of this pandemic is that government over-ordered PPE, most of which after a year in storage wasn't fit for purpose anyway. The real scandal is they wasted £10 billion of our money, and the inquiry that is going on will not be discussing procurement until 2025. You simply couldn't make it up. So I ask you, is the Michelle Mone story the real scandal of the pandemic, or is what I'm talking about far bigger? Please give me your thoughts. Farage@gbnews.com. Well, I'm joined by Neil Wallace, former Chief Executive Editor of the News of the World. Neil, welcome to the new studios.
Welcome. Very plush.
It looks good. So far, so good.
Yeah. So, haven't broken it yet.
There's always time. The Baroness Mone story, how do you respond to it?
I think you're half right and half wrong. I think where you're half right, the figures are shocking, they're appalling. She is simply unbelievably, dreadfully crass. I mean, she deserves everything she's getting. You know, if your defence is I basically lied to the world because I wanted to pocket 60 million quid, you need better PR advisors. Where I think what you miss is that at the time, the world was panic-stricken.
Yep.
I think what you're not taking into account is this wasn't just happening in this country. We were bidding for this stuff against America, against the Chinese themselves who were making it, against the EU. They were all bidding against each other because they were all panic-stricken. And what the real scandal, I think, of COVID is going to be, we got it wrong. Jeremy Hunt was supposed to plan for this, and he got it catastrophically wrong. And that led inevitably to one thing. Now, I understand.
I get that, Neil. I mean, look, you know, we had Professor Neil Ferguson telling us goodness knows what was coming down the track of this. But the fact is they ordered 5 years' worth of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you can't argue with any of that. What it really shows you, I think, Nigel, is the complete panic that was in the government at the time. They didn't have a clue what to do. And so they were running around like headless chickens, buying here, grabbing this, taking it off the shelves. It was just the same as when, do you remember when there was the toilet paper shortage and you saw people wheeling great wheelie bins of the stuff down the road? Do you remember?
I do.
This was an international government-sized version of that.
Shouldn't we expect better of our leaders?
I think we should certainly have expected better of our structure, of our civil servants, of our... yes, you're right, of course we should. Yeah. But they were panic-stricken.
Yeah, that's not an excuse. I expect better from our leaders.
Yeah, I think you're entitled to.
And the thought to me that this endless inquiry, which is going to go on for years, that we're not even going to discuss how 10 billion quid disappeared. It won't even come before the committee until 2025.
But Nigel, they're not even going to discuss where the damn thing came from. Did it originated in a Chinese laboratory? Yeah. Did it come from bats in wherever, Wuhan? You and I don't know, and we're not an inch nearer knowing. No. And this inquiry, which is going to throw as much money at this as MedPro got, right? Though who will get the £60 million profit, I don't know. Now, there is no question people like Michelle Mone and her husband are the unacceptable face of capitalism. They filled their boots.
They would argue, and they do argue, that everything they did was in line with standard government procedure of the time in the panic. And they would argue that the masks and gowns they got for the government were cheaper than many of their competitors.
They would argue that, and they've made 30% profit out of it, and they stand there. And I remember at the time how mealy-mouthed they were. We're doing this for the country. We're trying to help out.
No suggestion that I can see they've done anything illegal.
Well, we'll find that out, won't we? Because there is a criminal investigation.
They've been referred
to be honest,
to the NCA.
I think they are utterly appalling people. I'm a long-term conservative. I believe in free enterprise. But they fill their boots at this country's terror.
Well, their sin was to lie to the press. And people are saying, if you lie to the press, you've lied to the country. She has apologised for that. More will come out. But you see my point here. Whatever she may or may not have done wrong, what the government did is far worse.
I think that the catastrophe that came out of what the government failed to do, it's about government failings. You're absolutely right. Yeah. This was a catastrophic failure. And who paid for it? We're paying for it.
I know.
But what happened was there was this failure and people thought we can fill our boots here. Yeah, and amongst them was Michelle Mone.
And many, many others.
And many others.
Neil Wallace, as ever, great to have you in the studio. Now, on a happier, jollier note, we're going to have our last Farage at Large of the year. It takes place this Thursday evening, and it takes place in Birmingham. And we've got some very special guests here. Take a look at who they are. It's the rock group Wizard, whose song Could Be Christmas Every Day. Now, this was number one. It was number one 50 years ago. No, it was 1973. It was number one. Right. And it's gone down as one of those top 10 Christmas records ever. And Roy Wood and Wizard are getting back. There's 9 of them in the band. They're getting back together. They're going to play live for us on Thursday evening at the end of the show. And if you want to come along, there are some tickets, gbnews.com, but don't hang about. They'll be gone very, very quickly indeed. In a moment, I'm going to be discussing, is David Cameron really fit to be our Foreign Secretary? Because I think, given his track record, that he's not.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, some of your reactions to the whole debate around Baroness Mone, but what I think is even more important, 10 billion quid of taxpayers' money wasted on PPE that was never, ever used. Some of your thoughts. Peter says Mone and everyone else involved should be prosecuted, made to repay every penny and kicked out of the House of Lords in disgrace. Strong opinions there. Trevor says if Mone was that concerned about the NHS, why did they not give all the profits back to the NHS? Well, Trevor, maybe that's something the Baroness will consider. Another viewer says, and I like this, who placed the orders for the government? They should be held to account. And in tandem with that, Paul says, what could they do? Nobody had any experience of this. Paul, that's my problem. We have people in government spending huge amounts of our money who clearly didn't quite know what they were doing and were running around like headless chickens, and we're not going to get it debated or discussed properly by the inquiry until 2025. I don't find that acceptable. Now, whilst I was in my jungle, one of the extraordinary things that happened was the return of David Cameron. Yes, he was sort of elevated to Lord Cameron, and he is now the Foreign Secretary. And I looked today, Jimmy Lai, the former boss of the Hong Kong Apple Daily, is in court. He's facing sedition charges. It could lead to life imprisonment. And the Foreign Secretary says that the whole thing is politically motivated. Well, that's all well and good, but that's the Foreign Secretary who was PM, talked about the golden era of our relationships with China. And I worry when he speaks about Israel and Gaza, not capable of making an independent foreign policy position clear from the British government. No, doing it conjoined with the German foreign minister, and a joint article so clumsily worded that had even suggested that at some point the Israelis had actually targeted civilians. But then I guess it was probably drafted in German in the first place. Yes, this the David Cameron who was obsessed with bombing Libya, getting rid of Colonel Gaddafi, leading to the mass migrations across the Mediterranean, and indeed the birth of ISIS. Not to mention the Greenshill scandal and much else. Well, I'm joined by somebody who might take a more moderate view than that. I'm joined by Sir Mark Lyle-Grant, former UK security advisor and British permanent representative to the UN in David Cameron's time. Now, you know, what I'm saying, Sir Mark, is that on some very major foreign policy areas, and I'm really focusing particularly on China and indeed on Libya, that David Cameron got things, as we would now see it, very badly wrong.
I think his appointment as Foreign Secretary is actually quite an inspired choice, Nigel.
Do you?
Because he has a huge amount of experience, he can hit the ground running, he knows all the world leaders already, and so in a relatively short period that he might have as Foreign Secretary before the next election, he can actually make an impact. So I think he's got a lot of credibility within the Foreign Office. They're delighted to have a big feast, as it were,
that doesn't
as the
necessarily
head of the department. But he will fight for British interests overseas. He has a lot of credibility in terms of experience, in terms of his development assistance, in terms of climate change. So I would argue that he could be a very good Foreign Secretary for this period.
He's got a lot of big calls wrong, though, hasn't he?
Well,
I mean, Libya, come
was
on.
involved.
Libya, come on, let's face it. We got rid of Gaddafi. Look what it's led to.
No, but that was a good decision. That saved hundreds of thousands of civilian lives in Libya. I was involved in that. I was the ambassador at the UN at the time. I got the resolution through. I was drafted by me and my team in New York, and I would defend that decision to the hilt. We had to stop Gaddafi from massacring his own civilians. Now, China, you can argue about. But again, I was involved in that decision as a national security advisor. And I can tell you, Nigel, that we did discuss the issue very carefully in the National Security Council on more than one occasion. How important was the prosperity agenda? How important the values? How important security? But the reality is that for a country like the UK needs to have an economic relationship with the second largest economy in the world. And that's the sort of balance that the government is trying to do.
But we were prepared to turn a blind eye to industrial espionage and much else.
No, we certainly didn't turn a blind eye to that. Absolutely not.
Huawei getting involved in our communications networks.
That was a decision that was very carefully thought through. It changed for a number of different reasons because the Chinese government approach changed. It changed and toughened on Hong Kong. It changed and toughened with the National Security Act, which meant that countries like Huawei would have to report to the intelligence agencies. So a lot of things changed and the policy changed accordingly.
On the bigger picture, and never say, GB News audience, you don't hear both sides of the argument here because you do. It seems that international support for Israel is waning very, very quickly.
I think that is true. Not quickly, but it is waning. And we've seen that over the last few weeks. The language by the traditional allies of Israel, if you like, which is the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom and Germany, the language has shifted. And the Americans in particular are taking a much tougher line, both in private, but also now in public. Because I think the extent of the civilian casualties in Gaza has surprised and taken aback Israel's closest allies. And the way they're conducting this operation, the international community is concerned that is storing up problems for the future in terms of radicalizing the Palestinian youth. And probably the biggest issue, which isn't much discussed in the news, is the stopping of BP and almost all the top shipping container companies passing through the Red Sea because of the Houthis. Now, that is going to add to our oil costs, it's going to add to our commodities costs and directly affect the British economy.
I think there are some international shipping problems beyond even that. And I'm with you, I'm quite worried about that. But, you know, when Ben Wallace, you know, our really quite well-respected former Defence Secretary, talks about Israeli killing rage this morning, this is quite aggressive language being used, isn't it?
That isn't language that the government is using.
No, but I was surprised that Ben Wallace used it.
Yes, I think that is slightly inflammatory language. Clearly, Israel has a right to self-defense. It's had that since the atrocities committed by Hamas on the 7th of October. But the danger right from the start, Nigel, was that the way they conducted the operation would make the situation in the longer term worse, both for the region and more globally. And I fear that we're reaching a sort of tipping point now where even Israel's closest allies cannot see the sort of devastation being wrought in Gaza go on day after day.
Difficult situation that Netanyahu finds himself in.
Very
because if
difficult
Hamas aren't eliminated, they'll come back and do it all again.
Indeed, and he hasn't achieved the publicly set out military objectives he put there. He hasn't killed the 3 Hamas leaders in Gaza. He hasn't freed all the hostages. He hasn't destroyed Hamas's military capability, let alone its political organization. So from his point of view, he wants to keep going. He feels he has to keep going. But if America says enough is enough and they allow through a UN Security Council resolution demanding a ceasefire tonight, then I think they're going to have to think again.
Difficult call, Tamar. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, there's a protest going on as we speak, advertised to be a large protest, and it's taking place outside the Home Office. Ray Addison is GB News' man on the ground. Ray. I'm assured that he is there. Now, this is being organised by Care for Calais, trade unions, a whole host of groups who are protesting about the government's policies on immigration. I think we should call this the open borders lot. But, Ray, I believe you're there now to give us a full report.
Yeah, good evening, Nigel. It's very low turnout, probably around 100, maybe 150 at most here this afternoon at this event outside of the Home Office. As you said, it's been organised by 18 different campaign groups and organisations, including Black Lives Matter. We've got Care for Calais, Stand Up to Racism. The PCS union is involved as well. And I think that will be particularly disappointing for the organisers because there are so many people involved and such a small turnout from each of them. It's actually so small, I don't know if we can just pan the camera around. They didn't even bother to block the road off because they're just letting cars come through here. In fact, we had Richard Bergen, Labour MP for Leeds East, and he actually stopped his speech in the middle to let a double-decker bus come through, and they perhaps could have fitted everybody that's come to watch these speeches on that double-decker bus. That's how few people we actually have here. Now, of course, they've come here under the banner of stopping hate. Refugees are welcome. And of course, it falls on the United Nations International Migrants Day. And they wanted it to be a bit of a party atmosphere. They had a DJ, they had a band as well. And speakers, including, as I said, Richard Bergen, but also Jeremy Corbyn, who declined to come on and give us an interview. But what they're saying is that the government's Rwanda plan, deportation plan, they say is heinous. They say that the government is using racist policies and rhetoric, and they're concerned that because of the terms and the phraseology that the government is using, what they describe as the far right is growing across Britain. And to demonstrate that, they say, look at the protests outside of asylum seekers' hotels and former military bases where people are being housed while they wait for their applications to be processed. They say that's an example of far right activity. Of course, lots of our viewers would disagree with that. Now, although they do celebrate the sacking of Suella Braverman, former Home Secretary, they do say that the new Home Secretary, James Cleverly, is continuing, in their words, racist scapegoating. Now, earlier on, I chatted to Waylon Bennett, who is from Stand Up to Racism. This is what he had to say.
We're doing it because we believe that politics has been poisoned in Britain. Instead of refugees being treated in a humane way, they're being treated as a catastrophic problem when actually they're a relatively minority problem, and Britain takes a minority of the refugees across the world. And we believe that immigration is being pumped up as an issue to misdirect the British population to say that the crisis in the NHS, the crisis in our transport system, or the crisis in our education is not due to underinvestment, it's due to refugees, and particularly actually black refugees or Muslim refugees.
Well, you'll be very disappointed to hear that you've also come in for a bit of criticism here tonight, Nigel, from one of the speakers on the stage. They called you one of the most divisive people in Britain. Why? Well, they said, just look at the situation with Nella Rose. She was paid $40,000 compared to your $1 million plus to go on I'm a Celebrity. She was eliminated second to you coming in third. And they say that is what it is like for immigrants and black women in Britain. That's what they're saying on the stage here today.
Well, thank you for that, Ray. Absolute bunkum, but thank you for that. And I'd have been very upset if I hadn't taken some abuse from that particular very, very small crowd that have gathered, and I'm delighted to hear how few of them there were. And these people believe in total open borders. The vast majority don't. In a moment, we'll talk about charities now being debanked. Well, we had some good news last week. The politically exposed persons, up to 100,000 of them, are going to get better treatment for the banks. But what's happening to our charities? All of that in just a moment.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Wake up to the headlines with headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Flights.
Well, I may have shifted banks to Lloyds and my problems may be over, but I'm not going to give up on this story, because what I've heard in the last 24 hours is now about charities, quite a lot of them being given a hard time. Well, David Soffer, founder and editor-in-chief of TechRound and friend of this programme. David, what is the latest debanking scandal?
So the latest is now that charities are being debanked, and we, on TechRound, we received a message from a charity who said that over 1,000 other charities depend on them, so therefore thousands of people depending on them for hot meals this Christmas alone. Yeah. And they've seen around £1 million of donations having been blocked for a technicality at best and something unbeknownst to them at worst, which is really quite concerning, because when you compare it to an individual like yourself even, being debanked, people have dependents. Charities have thousands of dependents and people who will go without hot meals, shelter, blankets.
And do we know why this is happening?
So, no, not really. Potentially a technicality that has been, if you like, blown out of all proportion.
And the finger's being pointed specifically here, not solely, but specifically to Allied Irish Bank, isn't it?
I believe so, but It's something that we keep getting repeatedly at TechRound is people contacting us from challenger banks, from high street banks. We've had recently the charity that I mentioned, but also investors. And when you think of the same kind of multiple, you think how many people rely on investors, numerous businesses that they would have invested in, but also employees of the business, the employees' dependents. So you're looking at a lot more people being affected by this than I think anyone would have even expected.
But we have a financial conduct authority to save us and to be our guardians in financial matters. Where are they?
Very good question. And actually, I would argue maybe a bit stronger, and I'd say in a time where I think people are, I don't want to say addicted to involvement by the state in their lives, and people are really enjoying the hand of the state in their lives and calling for more, this is something that people should be calling for and saying this is what the regulator and the government should be involving themselves with over almost anything else.
I couldn't agree more. David, you keep us up to date with all those developments. Thanks for popping back in to the studio. I will not let this go. Now, we always keep an eye on Sadiq Khan. My What the Farage today is a job advert for Stuart Ross Communications Internship, and what you'll need for your applications if you're going to join TfL in 2024 are some very specific protected characteristics. Yes, absolutely. Don't apply for this job unless you are black, Asian, or from other minority ethnic backgrounds and or people with a disability. Well, we have an Equality Act of 2010 that allows people to do this. They're not allowed to use positive discrimination, but they're allowed to up quotas of what they see as underrepresented minorities. All I can tell you is, I believe it's better to employ people on ability, whether they fit for the role. All we're doing here is spreading division. It's nuts. Much of what happens in the world these days is, including the Royal Yachting Association. Can you believe it? They've been around forever, an august institution, but now you mustn't say man overboard. No, you've got to say person overboard. I mean, God help us. Have you ever heard such a load of total PC rubbish in all your life? In Ireland, the Ross Lake Hotel in Galway was about to have, sometime this week, 70 migrants put into it. Last week, somebody set it on fire. And it just goes to show, whatever those people think who are protesting and using my name in vain outside the Home Office at the moment, tempers in Ireland on this are running very, very strong indeed. Now, we are regulated by Ofcom. You all know that, but I am stunned by this ruling. Do you remember our Don't Kill Cash campaign? 300,000 people signed up to it. I went on behalf of GB News and delivered those signatures to number 11 Downing Street. The Chancellor in return saying what we were standing for was right. And actually, there are up to 5 million people in Britain who, if cash was got rid of, would literally be excluded from normal everyday activities. And yet, Ofcom have ruled against us. Yes, they really, really have. Apparently, we've got involved with a campaign on which we should have taken a neutral position. But that's OK. The BBC can fundraise for the NHS. Sky News can campaign on the way that general elections are covered, and that's fine. All we try to do as a media organisation is to stand up for those who haven't got a voice of their own, and we get wrapped over the knuckles for it. Absolutely blooming ridiculous. Now, I'm broadcasting tonight from this brand new studio, and it's named the Alistair Stewart Studio. And in a moment, Alistair will join me for Talking Pints.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan, Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks, the admission's free.
There's only 3 people you can trust in life. Your doctor, your lawyer and your nana.
I'm not sure.
So join me, Nana Aquare, at 3 p.m. every Saturday and Sunday where we discuss the biggest topics of the weekend. Be ready for battle. Could you be quiet? What is this?
It's my new teeth.
It's your new teeth. I don't bite. Well, not without a good reason. Always honest, always fun. Every weekend at 3 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, we're here in this new studio, and it's a great new studio, and it's named the Alistair Stewart Studio, after that legendary, veteran, now retired broadcaster, of course, whose last couple of years worked with us at GB News. Alistair, welcome to your studio.
Isn't it wonderful?
How cool is that?
It's just delightful, because when I became ill, before I'd had the formal diagnosis of vascular dementia, which you and I were chatting about beforehand, I decided it was time to step back a bit, because that clearly wasn't helping whatever was wrong with me. And Angelo, our mutual boss, said, fine, completely understand that, but we want you to stay on the books so I can come and do things like this and occasionally appear on other programmes as well, which is absolutely marvellous. And he said, and by the way, our new studios at Westminster, we're going to name after you. And I was deeply touched. Well,
here we are, and this is we are christening the studio right now.
You're very good health, Nigel.
Now, Alistair, you know, your father, RAF officer, and you go off to university, and no hint at all that you're going to become a journalist. What happened?
It's a curious story. I was deputy president of the National Union of Students, broad left. And my president was Charles Clarke, who became a very close friend of mine and still is. I had lunch with him the other day. Brilliant, brilliant guy. And one of the last things I was campaigning about was teacher training. And Margaret Thatcher and her advisers had spotted that there was a decline in the birth rate and therefore didn't need to spend all of this taxpayers' money on training more teachers. We could actually train fewer and still do a good job. So they proposed to close teacher training colleges or merge them and create a wave of new universities, some of which turned out to be brilliant ones, like Winchester, where my own daughter went. So I was touring the country saying, don't do this, keep them open, keep training the same numbers of teachers, and then lo and behold, there'll be a better teacher-pupil ratio. It's fairly logical, fairly called common sense. And one of those colleges that I spoke at was King Alfred's College in Winchester, and the local president of the Student Union phoned up Southern TV in Southampton and said, look, one of our big guns from up north, from, headquarters is in the region. Do you want to talk to him? And they said yes. And purely as a result of that, they contacted me the next day and said, well, that went very well indeed. Have you ever thought of going into television?
Well.
And I said, no, I'm going to be an MP and rule the world. And it was my dad, who you were kind enough to mention, the Royal Air Force officer, terribly conservative with both a big and a little C, who said, you must be mad. Give it a whirl, see how it goes. And that was half a century ago.
Well, yeah, and I mean, you finish up, ITN, 1979, and these were the days of huge audiences. I mean, the evening news on ITN was getting 10, 12 million people every day watching it, and huge personalities. The Alistair Burnett's, the Reggie Bosanquets, the suspicion that when one or two of them went on the news, they might have been in the bar previously. I think it was an amazing culture, wasn't it?
I think there was. I mean, I remember having a conversation with an American friend who came to work at ITN on the press and PR side, concerned about the amount of drinking that was going on and the amount of drinking I was doing. I mean, we were all up to it because you kind of aspired to be like Reggie or be like Alistair. Yeah. And she said to me, she said, I don't know whether you've got a drinking problem or not. Only you and your family know that. And she said, but I'll tell you what, ITN's got a drinking problem. And I think in those days it did. And I think it was genuinely a part of the culture. And there was a bar in the building and everybody smoked. And it was a mixture of people like Greg Dyke at London Weekend Television and Stuart Purvis, who you know very well, went on to be a big, big figure at Ofcom, who said, look, this is bonkers. We shouldn't be having a bar and drinking on site, let alone smoking. No. And so, slowly but surely, they drew back from it.
You were in the middle of all of this, but also, Alistair, in the middle of some amazing historic news stories. We've got one or two little clips. The first one is you outside the Brandenburg Gate that we're going to show.
It's the people who made the politicians make it happen. The people have said to the politicians, this is our country, we will decide its future. Alistair.
Thank you all, gentlemen. Well, it has been a quite extraordinary story, brimful with political significance and with raw emotion. It's one of those stories you only see once in a while, and yet it may be the beginning, as I think all of us were saying, of something with a much greater and deeper significance. What is not in doubt is that history has been made and unmade in Berlin over the last 4 days.
Absolutely. I love that, Alistair. Brimful. We wouldn't hear that word used on British television now, would we? No. That was a big historic moment. And other dramatic moments when you're sitting behind the desk in London. This news flash after Pan Am 103 went down over Lockerbie.
A Pan Am 747 jumbo jet with 255 people on board has crashed just north of the Scottish border. There's an emergency telephone number in America. It's 0101 212 880 1234. Pan Am flight PA 103 took off from London Heathrow, bound for John F. Kennedy Airport in New York at 6:25 this evening. Radar contact was lost at 7:19. The plane came down in the town of Lockerbie in Dumfriesshire. It crashed into a petrol station and a number of houses. Eyewitnesses report a huge explosion and a 300-foot fireball.
Nobody had a clue that we'd all been at a function at number 11 with the then Chancellor, Nigel Lawson, funnily enough, and word had gone round that there'd been some terrible fireball accident just south of the border. But it was only several hours later that rumours then began to circulate about terrorism and the rest of it. And many people, particularly the parents of the victims, because it was full of young American students going back for the Christmas holidays, as well as Brits, still think it's unresolved because there was a man who was convicted and charged and in the days of Gaddafi and all the rest of it. But a real nightmare, a horrible story.
Yeah, but you covering tragic stories, happy stories, breaking news stories. What always struck me whenever I would turn up at the ITM building and inevitably see you outside the building, pacing up and down, and you'd be straight over, Farage, you know, and you want to sort of get into the, you know, what's the real story? Curiosity. I always thought with you, there was something about you that you loved this world because you're a curious person by nature.
Yes, I think that's true. And again, you mentioned Dad, and going back to the Berlin one, Dad was in fighter command initially and used to fly jets like Javelins and Hunters to see off Russian bombers that were testing our airspace. Yeah. And then he spent the final 15, 20 years of his RAF career in Bomber Command. So he was on our side of the Cold War. So I remember standing in Berlin with Jon Snow and John Suchet, thinking, good God, he was right, because he was a mutually assured destruction guy. We had to have the bomb, otherwise, you know, the other side might attack us.
And of course, Vulcan bombers in those days
was our means of
delivery.
The V-Force, Vulcans, Valiants and Victors.
Absolutely.
But yes, and I was blessed with a dad who was incredibly bright, very, very able, grammar school boy, St Andrews University, and there was nothing I couldn't ask him. There were occasionally things that might cross into state secrecy, and he'd say, that's not one for you. And so we'd move on. But like ban the bomb, he was up for a conversation, and I was blessed in that respect.
Well, political debate, I mean, your real high point of this, of course, the first ever party leader debates that it been going since 1960 in America, but it was 2010, the first leaders debate in this country. Have a guess, folks, who was in the chair?
Manchester, in the heart of the northwest of England, is tonight host to a British political first. I'm Alistair Stewart, and for the first time on British television, live in front of a representative studio audience, we'll be hearing from three men, each hoping to be the leader of the next UK government in the first election debate.
Stuff, Alistair, and you're there, you do all these things over 40 years. Over 40 years you're there, and they get rid of you. You're a victim of cancel culture. You were rejected by them for quoting Shakespeare.
The pieces that were written at the time by our mutual acquaintance Andrew Neil and Fraser Nelson at The Spectator and many, many others were very, very interesting. Anyone who saw racism in that exchange neither understood racism nor did they understand the Bard, despite the great anniversary of the first folio and the rest of it. I was sad to retire from GB News, but it was the right thing to do because of my health.
We were delighted to have you. You were the grand old man of GB News,
well,
you know.
And I tell you this, GB News looked after me extremely well when I started to become ill and when we jointly decided it was time to step back. They couldn't have been nicer, nor could they have been kinder.
Good.
And I really value that, and so does my family.
You've got, you know, early onset dementia, Alistair. You're in retirement. How does Alistair Stewart deal with retirement?
Not terribly well. I mean, I still watch day in, day out and listen to the radio as well and look as many papers as I can. And the deal that I've got with Angelo and others in the sort of, the suits, as it were, at GB News is if I spot something where I think I might have a contribution or where I'm kind of slightly fired up about something, then I simply do a quick email and say, look, I'd be very happy to talk to, whether it's you or Martin or whomsoever it is, it doesn't matter, or Jacob. I'm really up for doing that. And we've done it about half a dozen times so far, and it seems to have worked. And quite often it is because I'm listening to so many things, and I was listening, of all things, to the Education Select Committee the other day. And Rob Halfon, who used to chair it brilliantly, but is now the Universities Minister, was giving evidence, particularly about those undergraduates and postgraduates who are supporting Hamas. And he said, unfortunately, our great British universities have always been polluted by what I think used to be called useful idiots. And I remember calling people in my NUS days useful idiots, and they were the trots who supported the Provisional IRA in their bombing campaign. So I phoned up and we had a really good conversation about that.
So you're not really retired at all, are you?
I'm resting. I'm retired from doing a regular show like you and like Jacob and the others.
You keep coming back when you've got something to say, and it's a pleasure to have you tonight in this studio, named in your honour after a long and illustrious career. Alistair, You're a star.
You're very, very kind. And here I am drinking hot chocolate because, as a good friend of mine once said, you know, I'm one of those people to whom alcohol is not a friend. God bless you both. Lovely to see you both.
I'm one of those. Jacob, what have we got today?
Well, Nigel, first of all, it's good to see you back. I haven't seen you since you returned from the jungle.
I know.
And you look the same. I thought you might have...
a little bit thinner.
But congratulations, you did very well. And I see you're enormously popular, which is not bad. What are we doing? We're going to be talking about Esther McVeigh's war on woke.
Good.
Which I think is marvellous. My concern is, until we do something about the Equalities Act, she will be stymied by people saying...
I sense a manifesto pledge coming, or one that Jacob would like.
Well, we might both like.
But I'll be back with you tomorrow night at 7 o'clock.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hi there, it's Aidan McGibbon here from the Met Office with the GB News forecast. It is going to turn increasingly wet in the south overnight. Clearer skies developing further north, albeit with blustery showers. And we've got colder air coming in as well from the northwest. But before that happens, a number of weather fronts will linger across the southern half of the UK, bringing extensive cloud and increasingly persistent rain, initially for southwest England and Wales. That rain moving into the Midlands, East Anglia, and the south and southeast of England by the early hours. So a wet night to come for many, but further north we've got clear spells, especially for central and northern Scotland, and where that happens, a touch of frost is possible out of the wind. Now, into the start of for Tuesday, we've got outbreaks of rain or showers moving into the north and west of Scotland, as well as Northern Ireland. It's cold enough for these showers to be falling as snow over the hills. Further south, a mild start to the day, but a wet one, with outbreaks of persistent rain through the morning, eventually clearing by the end of the afternoon from the southeast. Clear spells then follow, with some decent spells of sunshine for the central and southwestern part of the UK, but blustery showers continue further north. Those showers also affect the northeast of Scotland into Wednesday. Elsewhere, increasing cloud and outbreaks of rain moving in. The most damp weather affecting the northwest once again, brightest further southeast after a chilly start. Thursday sees very strong winds from the northwest, gales widely, and some heavy showers.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you.
GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too. Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. The new Minister for Common Sense, former GB News star Esther McVey, comes out fighting in the war on woke and waste. Ms McVey vows to make sure not a penny of taxpayers' money is squandered on silly schemes and socialist stratagems, taking particular aim at the vacuous roles of expensive diversity officers. So what challenges will be in Esther's in tray in order to achieve such admirable and essential